I was never free. Not when I smiled for the cameras, not when I cut ribbons at openings beside my father, not even at the parties where everyone called me princess with that admiring superficial tone. I was born with the Arwenhart surname, and that was always more important than my own name. From a young age, I learned there was no room for mistakes. My hair, my tone of voice, my friendships, my clothes, my opinions, everything had to be sought out, adjusted, approved. I became a polished version of myself, an impeccable facade, admired from a distance, but untouchable. Inside, I was dying little by little, not from explicit pain, but from silence, from not being able to say that the loneliness of being perfect was a prison disguised as reverence. I knew how to smile while swallowing my desires. I knew how to speak without saying what I thought. I knew how to pretend perfection didn't hurt until the man who didn't look at me as an heir, but as someone who could still be whole. I don't remember the exact moment our eyes met, but I remember the feeling. It was as if for an instant someone had turned off the world and let me hear my own heart. He didn't belong to that universe of well-dressed men with veiled intentions. He was direct, even rough, and had a way of speaking as if his words carried real weight, not shaped to please. I was wary, then curious, then entangled. It didn't take long. A few conversations were enough for me to find myself wanting more. Not his body, not yet, but his freedom. The way he looked at me without the filter of my surname. The way he didn't hesitate to disagree with me as if I were an ordinary person. Not the controlled face of the Arwenhart lineage. For the first time, I felt I didn't have to perform. With him I could exist, and that's why I gave myself to him. Not as someone making a mistake, but as someone deciding, for the first time, to choose something just for herself. A choice that came from the heart, not from duty. And at that moment I didn't know. I couldn't know that every surrender carries its risk, and that not every sincere gaze holds pure intent. But I dove in anyway, because what existed in me was already too hungry to ignore. Hunger to be touched as a woman, not a display. Hunger to be heard as a human, not a legacy. And he, with his husky voice and promises whispered in the dark, seemed to offer exactly that. Except sometimes what feels like freedom is just the start of another prison, more dangerous, deeper, harder to escape. It began almost invisibly. Brief messages exchanged after public events, glances that lingered too long, quick meetings disguised as coincidence. And I, Kaelith Arwenhart, trained to spot risks, molded to control impulses, let it all happen. Not out of carelessness, but out of desire. For the first time I didn't weigh the consequences. I let myself be carried away. And the strangest thing is that I didn't regret it. Not in the early days. Not in the first kisses. The feeling of finally living something that was mine was so intoxicating that everything else felt like noise. I left my mother's foundation meetings with the same composure as always, attended dinners with diplomats with the same polite smile, but inside, my heart beat for him. Not because of who he was, but because of who I became when I was with him. Someone unafraid. He said exactly what I wanted to hear, but with a naturalness that didn't feel false. He said the world around me was fake, suffocating, and that only with me could he be real. I believed him, because I needed it to be true. I started hiding more often, skipping commitments for afternoons in anonymous apartments, lying to my personal assistant, pulling away from everything that was once predictable. With each day, I buried a little more of the woman the world knew and made space for the one he awakened. My parents didn't suspect, or if they did, they chose to pretend. They thought I was just tired. They said the pressure was high, that it was natural for me to want to breathe. Little did they know I'd already plunged headfirst into something with no return. The curious thing is that there were moments when something inside me trembled, like when he avoided talking about his personal life in detail, when he changed the subject when business came up, when he disappeared for days without explanation. I noticed, but I chose not to confront him. I told myself it was too soon, that he needed space, that maybe he didn't want to overwhelm me with his past. I was generous with my doubts, aware of my own warnings, and still I ignored them, because my body reacted first, and my mind, which had protected me from pain for so many years, this time stayed silent. Being with him was vertigo. It was freedom. But I didn't yet know I was actually giving up the little control I still had, and that when the fall came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would come as ruin. The ruin didn't arrive dramatically. There was no sudden explosion that swept the ground from under me. It came like the most dangerous storms, with a sky too calm, a wind too still, a false peace that foreshadows collapse. Everything seemed stable, almost beautiful. He began to frequent the edges of my life, subtly, cleverly, strategically. He knew my driver by name, learned my assistant's schedule, memorized the security circuits of the foundation's building. I found it charming. I told myself it was care, involvement, a kind of passionate devotion. Only later did I realize he was studying my steps with the precision of someone preparing to invade, and I handed over the keys. The first crack came through a leaked conversation. A tabloid journalist hinted that the princess of the Arwenhart family was involved with a nameless man tied to a shell company with a history of scandals. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. Just another attempt by the press to spin stories for clicks. I didn't care, but he got strange. His expression when I mentioned the article was that of someone not caught off guard, but who didn't expect me to know. A hard silence fell between us that day. For the first time, there were no kisses in the elevator, no hands held in the dark. Just that look, a look that didn't know how to lie, but also didn't confess. And there, a part of me knew, but wasn't ready to admit it. The days that followed were strangely normal, and that's what terrified me. Because I, who had always lived among people trained to keep up appearances, recognized the performance. He smiled more, complimented me more, kissed me with more hunger, as if he knew time was running out and wanted to extract everything from me before the mask fell. And it fell. It collapsed all at once, with no room for escape. Through an internal leak, the press received documents linking my name, to a multi-million-dollar deal with companies tied to tax fraud. The contracts were forged, the emails manipulated, the meetings fake. But the signature was mine. The exposure was brutal. Headlines, cameras. My parents with a look of anger and disappointment at once. And me in the middle of the hurricane, not knowing how to prove I'd fallen, that I'd been used, that I'd given myself to the wrong man. I tried to find him. I tried desperately. But he vanished, evaporated as if he'd never existed. No trace, no note, no, "I'm sorry." Just the void. And there, with my reputation in ruins, with the Arwenhart name dragged through the mud, with every gaze weighing on me like blades, I understood. The mistake wasn't just giving myself to him. It was believing I'd be the exception, that he wanted me for who I was, when in reality, all he needed was access. And I gave it. I gave everything, including the hardest thing to recover, my trust. At first the shame hurt more than the betrayal, because before I could feel the anger he deserved, I had to cross the abyss of what others saw in me. The exemplary daughter, the poised heir, the immaculate woman who always walked the line. now stained, humiliated, exposed. The news called me naive, but not with pity, with contempt. They said I'd traded stability for adventure, duty for desire, power for passion. No one asked how I was. They only wanted to know how I let this happen, as if the greater mistake wasn't his malice, but my fragility. And that's where the world shows its cruelest face. It can forgive a cunning liar, but never a woman who allowed herself to be deceived. The days turned into blurs of silence, sidelong glances, and closed doors. My parents, always so concerned with appearances, limited themselves to preserving the surname. Conversations reduced to damage control strategies, how to salvage the image, how to erase the traces, how to make the public forget, but no one spoke of the pain. No one hugged me. No one told me it was human to love and heir. And in the middle of that storm, I became stone. A stone that bled inside, but no longer allowed cracks on the outside. Because if I faltered again, I'd be destroyed. I realized this clearly on the third day of the scandal, when I looked in the mirror and for the first time saw no expression. No anger, no sadness, no fear. Just emptiness, as if something in me had died with him. And the cruelest part was knowing he was alive somewhere, with my name still caught between his fingers. I began to isolate myself, not out of shame, but necessity. The walls of my home became both shield and prison. I reviewed every message, every moment, every look, every kiss, every word. I searched for a sign that said, here was the warning, here you could have stopped. But it was useless, because he didn't pretend to be perfect. He was exactly what I needed, attentive, intense, available. And that was the most unforgivable thing. He didn't deceive me with impossible promises. He gave me just enough truth to let myself fall. And that's why the fall hurt more, because part of me still wanted to believe that, despite everything, there was some love amidst the manipulation. But true love doesn't wound with such precision. It doesn't take everything and leave without explanation. Love can be hard, but it's not cowardly. And he was. He vanished. Like a thief who steals not just the gold, but the roof, the windows, the bed, and leaves you naked in the street. And there, naked before public opinion, my family, myself, I began to understand that no one would come to save me. Not my father, not my mother, certainly not him. For the first time, I'd have to learn to rise without asking permission or forgiveness. The pain stopped being sharp. It became constant. It no longer screamed. It just existed. A weight in my chest, a knot in my throat that didn't unravel even on the days I managed to sleep a little. The people around me kept circling around what was lost. Cancelled contracts, silent gossip columns, broken alliances. But I no longer cared about what was seen from the outside, because what was broken now was what I believed about myself. I, who had always been the mirror of others' expectations, no longer knew whose face stared back at me in the morning. I stepped away from the media, from family, from entourages. I deleted my social media. I silenced the world like someone closing their eyes in a shipwreck, because everything from the outside hurt me, but nothing hurt more than the memory of the woman I was with him. In the silence, I began to hear what was inside. The anger at last came, not as an explosion, but as heat, a latent energy that first burned, then pushed. The anger wasn't just for him. It was for me, for staying quiet when I suspected, for excusing absences, vague words, disjointed stories, for letting myself believe I needed that love to be whole. And then I realized I gave myself to him not just because I wanted to be loved, but because I'd never allowed myself to love, myself outside the frame they'd built for me, He was the poison, but I was the cup. And that was the hardest thing to swallow. I started asking questions no one else asked. I chased the clues the journalists ignored. His financial trail, the contracts hidden behind shell companies, the fake names used in other cities. What I found was worse than I expected. I wasn't the first, maybe not even the most important. There were other women, other stories, other names destroyed in silence. And somehow, that set me ablaze inside. It was no longer just about me. He was a pattern, a predator. And I, without meaning to, was now the face of many who stayed silent. If I didn't rise, he'd win again. Not just over me, but over all of us. That's when the pain turned into strength. I rose with small but steady steps. I started appearing again. Not in gossip columns, but in real places. I started speaking, not to clear my name, but to rebuild myself from the truth. And the more I spoke, the more I realized my story wasn't an isolated scandal. It was a reflection of something bigger, of how easy it is to discredit a woman when she gives herself, of how convenient it is to blame her for believing, and of how dangerous it is when she stops apologizing for having felt. The reconquest didn't happen with fiery speeches or grand acts of overcoming. It was in the silence of my own limits that I began to heal. And that silence hurt, but it also taught me. I learned not to apologize anymore for loving wrongly. I learned that naivety isn't a sin, that surrender isn't weakness, and that trusting, even someone who didn't deserve it, didn't make me small. His mistake was malice. Mine was humanity, and when I finally understood that, I stopped carrying the guilt that was never mine. The media, which had judged me with fury, began to watch me with caution. I was no longer the same woman fallen in scandal. Now I was the woman who looked forward, who exposed what no one wanted to see, who faced not just a man, but an entire system that profits from destroying women's reputations. I was invited to speak, first at a small, closed event, then at universities, then women's circles, then on talk shows. My name returned to the papers, but this time not as the perfect Arwenhart daughter. Now I was just Kaelith, and for the first time, that was enough. My father resisted. My mother stayed silent, but even in their discomfort they began to listen. They discovered there was something in me that even their best speeches couldn't control. Truth. And truth has a strange way of spreading. It starts by unsettling, then disturbs, and finally transforms. I no longer expected their approval. But something changed the day my father, after months of distance, looked at me with wet eyes and said, "You survived. I don't know if I could have." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come. And that's when I understood that the end wasn't failure. It was birth. The woman he destroyed would not return. But the one born from the pain was stronger than I'd ever dreamed of being. And in that rebirth, I discovered something even more powerful than love: autonomy. The freedom to never need saving again. To never again offer my body, my name, my worth as currency for affection. When he tried to reappear, because of course he did, with clumsy words, new promises, requests to talk, I was already someone else. I read his message, deleted it, and for the first time, I understood that silence could be a verdict. I didn't need to confront him, because nothing wounds a manipulator more than the woman he thought he'd destroyed, alive, standing, and completely out of his reach. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It came like a whisper at the end of a long storm, discreet, serene, but non-negotiable. It was on an ordinary morning, as I drank coffee alone on the balcony of the small apartment that was now mine, that I realized I no longer felt fear. I didn't care about the labels they'd tried to pin on me, or the gazes that once accused me. Something in me had broken free from the old ground where I was built. I was no longer an extension of my family, nor the woman who once trusted the wrong man too much. I was Kaelith, just that. And at last, that was everything. I went back to studying, not as an heir being groomed for power, but as a woman choosing knowledge as a path, not a showcase. I found pleasure in anonymity, in a simple routine, in the right to not be extraordinary. For the first time, I lived without needing to impress. I began writing about what I'd been through, not as a denunciation that had already been done, but as a testament, as a bridge for other women who also loved wrongly and were left with the wreckage. I wrote with anger, then with compassion, and finally with a kind of tenderness for the young woman who once believed love was just surrender. Now I know that true love begins with choosing oneself. That trust is something cultivated over time, not with promises whispered in haste. Many tried to define me by that scandal. Some still do. But I discovered that when you survive your own collapse, what others say no longer matters. Their words become small compared to your reconstruction. And my reconstruction was slow, yes, but it was mine, stone by stone, crack by crack. And beneath this new structure, there's no room for the old fear. It knocks sometimes, but it doesn't enter. Because today, I know the doors it used to slip through, and I keep them all locked. Is there still love in my life? There is. Yes, but not the kind that comes to complete me. It comes to add, and it only stays if it respects me whole. I didn't become bitter, I became lucid. And in that lucidity, I discovered I was never weak. I was trained to obey, to please, to perform, but not to exist on my own. Now I exist, with scars, with memories, with history, and with a peace that doesn't demand performance. The princess fell, the woman rose, and she never bows again. Sometimes they still ask about him. Sometimes they still call me the princess who fell for love. I smile. I let them think that. Let them stay trapped in the image of the woman who loved too much and was betrayed. I know who I am now. I know what I had to lose to find myself. I know what it cost to rebuild my life, not to prove something to the world, but to honor myself. The past hasn't vanished. It remains here, like a scar I don't want to erase, because it taught me to stop being molded and, at last, to be whole. I'm no longer the daughter of an empire. I'm what remained after the fire and what rose from the ashes, and this version of me is the truest that has ever existed.